My wife and daughter abandoned me when I was sick. Years later, they returned to claim my house. But there's more to the story. I was diagnosed with advanced Hodgkin's lymphoma, which shocked me because I had been active, ate well, and regularly saw the doctor for checkups. The oncologist explained that the exact cause of cancer is not fully understood. I had a slim chance of survival, but I needed intense chemotherapy. Despite the odds, I was prepared to fight for my life. After receiving my diagnosis, I sat down with my wife Janet, whom I'd been married to for 15 years, and my teenage daughter Layla. They were devastated, but I reassured them that I would do my best to battle the illness. I worried about how our family would cope, as the doctor warned that the chemotherapy would be tough and I would need all the support possible. The oncologist also cautioned that many marriages don't survive the treatment process. Later that night, I shared these worries with my wife. She promised to stand by me, uphold our vows, and assist me through the sickness. Fortunately, I had excellent insurance, substantial savings, and a trust fund from my late grandfather. While the treatment would be expensive, it wouldn't leave us in financial ruin. Our house was completely paid for, and I had already saved up money for my daughter's college in case something happened to me. My colleagues at work threw a farewell party and wished me well for my tough journey ahead. I began chemotherapy a week later, and it was incredibly harsh. When I returned home, I felt like I had been hit by a train. I could hardly take care of myself and had very little energy for basic tasks like walking or bathing. My wife and daughter did their best to assist me. They brought me food, managed the household chores, took me to my chemo appointments, and made sure I had my prescribed medications. I tried not to burden them too much and did small things for myself when I could. This went on for 2 months. I could tell that my wife and daughter were getting more and more frustrated with me. I sensed their hesitation whenever I asked for help. Even taking me to chemo seemed to annoy my wife. Things reached a breaking point when I had an early chemo appointment. One day, I noticed I was running a bit late and my wife had not come downstairs from our room. I called out to ask if she was ready, and she sounded tired and suggested that I just take an Uber to the hospital because she was worn out. I was really surprised at the time. Well, I'm not sure. I used Uber and also called the hospital to see if someone could meet me in the parking lot since my wife couldn't assist me. Thankfully, my Uber driver was a very kind woman. She made sure I got inside the building safely and even offered to pick me up when I was done to take me home. I appreciated it, but it was a bit odd and embarrassing to rely on strangers. After getting back home later that day, I rested for a while, and then talked to my wife and daughter about how they'd been acting. I brought up how they seemed distant recently and asked if they thought I was a burden. My wife mentioned that they were just feeling overwhelmed, and my daughter said she didn't expect me to need so much help. I suggested hiring a nurse to come a few days a week to assist me and take me to chemo. I also ordered a wheelchair to make it easier to move around when I'm too weak to walk. They agreed with the ideas. I asked the hospital for suggestions, and they sent me a kind but firm in-home nurse. She ensured I made it to my chemo appointments on time, took my medications promptly, and even created a plan for my care that included healthy meals. Everything was going well. The doctors were happy with my progress, but my wife and daughter still didn't seem content. While I was less of a burden now, my wife felt like the nurse was replacing her. I talked to my wife about it. I proposed that if she could handle taking me to chemo, managing my prescriptions, and making sure I ate and took my meds as needed, then I would be okay with letting go of the nurse. I had the nurse because I was a lot for my wife to handle, and she agreed to this compromise. She asked if I'd be okay with a male nurse instead, but I explained there weren't any available from the hospital's recommendations. They had assigned the nurse I had because she had experience with cancer patients and understood my needs. Besides, she was attentive, careful, and respectful. She treated my wife, daughter, and me kindly. The only way I'd consider letting her go was if my wife and daughter were willing to take on all the responsibilities the nurse was handling, but my wife wasn't open to that idea. She told me that I should take care of myself more instead of making my condition everyone else's issue. So, I questioned if she was thinking clearly. I already do everything I can on my own. Some days I could barely even lift my head, let alone stand up. The chemotherapy has really taken a toll on me. She got really angry and went upstairs, slamming doors. I decided to ignore her outbursts and focus on my recovery. Her negativity would only stress me out and worsen things. Later that night, My mother-in-law, who lives 2 states away, called me. She asked why I had brought another woman into her daughter's house. Technically, it's my house under my name. I owned it before we got married. But I chose not to be petty. I explained in a polite way that I needed help, and the level of assistance I required was more than her daughter was willing to give. So I had to bring in a nurse to help with my care, as the previous arrangement was too much for her daughter to handle. I still had at least a month of chemotherapy left, as long as the cancer didn't persist or worsen. The nurse wouldn't be around for much longer. My mother-in-law didn't seem completely convinced, but eventually left me alone, which was all I really wanted. Anyway, everything was going well for about a week after my treatment. Then, one day when I got back from chemo, I saw a moving truck parked in front of my house. My wife, son, and daughter had packed up and told me they were heading to their mom's place indefinitely. I felt hurt and upset, but I was too exhausted to express my feelings properly. What stung more was that she chose to do this right after my chemo session, knowing I'd be drained and unable to talk to her. It just seemed so heartless. I talked to my daughter to understand if this is what she really wanted. She was old enough to make her own decisions. She explained that she'd rather be with her mother because living with me had become too difficult. With tears in my eyes, I watched them leave. This was exactly what I had been fearing. When I began chemo, I already felt abandoned and unwanted. On that particular day, the nurse spent extra time with me and asked if I had any family who could be with me so I wouldn't be alone. My brother was the only family nearby, but he lived 3 hours away and had his own young children. Nevertheless, he said he'd take time off work to be with me until I could find a more permanent solution. When he came over, he was really angry about what my wife had done, calling her selfish and ungrateful. She never needed to have a job. The day after we got married, I ensured she didn't have to wait for anything. My brother could only take a week off work, but he proposed an alternative solution. His wife's sister, Kara, was going through a tough divorce and needed a safe place until she could stand on her own again. Since her husband was the one providing financially, she didn't have much money and couldn't afford rent alone. She was currently studying radiology at university on a scholarship. My home was nearer to the campus, so it worked out well. I'd have company in case of emergencies, and she'd have a place away from her soon-to-be ex-husband. I told my brother I was okay with the arrangement, and Kara wouldn't need to pay rent as she'd already be helping me out. She could choose any available bedroom. I wasn't concerned. My wife and daughter had taken everything except the bed and dresses. My brother stayed for the rest of the week, and on his last day, Kara arrived. He assisted her with her belongings, and she thanked me immensely for letting her stay. She promised to clean up after herself and pitch in where she could. She's really friendly. I assured her that she wouldn't need to do too much, as my nurse would be coming in 7 days a week instead of the usual 4. After saying goodbye to my brother, I did my best to help Kara settle in. Things went smoothly in the weeks that followed. I did miss my wife and daughter, although it seemed like I was the only one feeling that way, given that they didn't even call or check on me. Kara was a tremendous help. She handled most of the grocery shopping, cleaning, and even assisted with preparing meals without any complaints. About a month and a half after my wife left, I received the news that I was cancer-free. Ringing the bell at the hospital was a major highlight for me that year. My nurse asked what I wanted to do first, now that I was essentially cured, and I initiated divorce proceedings. Then I concentrated on the steps to recover from cancer, which was a journey in itself. Gradually, my strength and hair started to come back. My scars began to heal, and I started gaining weight. I mostly stuck to a healthy eating plan, but I allowed myself some cheat days to enjoy my favorite meals that I hadn't had in a while. It's been 6 months since I became cancer-free, and I believe I'm finally prepared to move forward with my life. I reached out to my previous job, and they're open to rehiring me for remote work if I decide to. I'm thinking of accepting the offer since I'm planning to move away. Although I like my current house, it holds too many painful memories. I want to start anew with something smaller. While she doesn't know it yet, I intend to give the house to Kara. She supported me during my lowest moments and showed incredible kindness, even though we were almost strangers. If she chooses, she can sell it. I don't want any connection to it anymore, and I definitely don't want my wife or daughter claiming it. My new residence is in a peaceful, rural neighborhood, and I'm excited for this fresh start. Hey everyone! It's been more than a year since I was initially diagnosed. I've settled well into my new home and neighborhood. There are many friendly people around, including my neighbors across the street. Dorothy, a widow who lives alone, quickly reached out to me. Her children are scattered across the country, but they visit during the holidays and her birthday. She invited me over for drinks and a chat on her porch, and she shared that she lost her husband to lung cancer. If he hadn't left a good life insurance, she and her children would have faced financial struggles. So I shared with her about what happened with my wife and daughter. I hadn't received any communication from them, which is okay. I've moved on. I've been spending my time exploring new hobbies. Woodworking has captured my interest, and I'm gradually building up a collection of tools. One day, when I returned from the hardware store, Dorothy mentioned that she saw some people hanging around my house. Thankfully, they didn't do anything harmful or steal. They approached the door, knocked a few times, wandered around the house a bit, and when nobody came out, they waited in their car for a while. She thought of calling the sheriff's office, but decided not to intervene too much, considering they could have been family. I inquired about their appearance, and she described a woman in her middle years and a teenage girl. That would be my wife and daughter. I'm puzzled about how they discovered where I live, as only my brother and his wife know my address. Why would they even be searching for me now? They left nearly a year ago without looking back. Dorothy advised me that if they returned, I shouldn't go out to confront them. Instead, she said she'd find out what they wanted. This suits me well, as I have no interest in engaging with them after they abandoned me during my lowest point. Later that evening, I called my brother, and he informed me that my wife and daughter had been causing trouble around my old house, bothering Kara and her roommate. Fortunately, she had official records proving that the house belonged to her and was registered under her name. Evidently, she told my wife a false story claiming that she bought the house from me. I think it was a wise decision, as revealing that I gave the house away for free might have made my wife very angry. Still, I feel bad that Kara had to go through that situation, so I personally called her to apologize. Hopefully, if they show up again, I can resolve this issue once and for all. I'm uncertain whether my wife is aware of the unilateral divorce or not. I believe my lawyer sent a copy to her mother's address, but it's possible they mistook it for junk mail and discarded it. In any case, it doesn't matter to me anymore. She and I are no longer together. Update number 2. My wife and daughter visited the house again. This time it was during the daytime while I was working. I heard a knock and checked the security cameras, confirming that it was indeed them. My ex-wife looked unchanged, but Layla had grown considerably. She was almost an adult now. Like Dorothy, I remained indoors but positioned myself closer to the door so I could hear them clearly. I overheard Dorothy going to greet them and introducing herself as the neighbor next door. My wife inquired if Dorothy was acquainted with a man named Richard who used to reside there. Dorothy's response mirrored my own confusion. Did she ask? Used to. My wife clarified that her husband, not ex-husband, used to live in this house before he passed away. Recently, she had discovered whether anyone was living there without permission, as her husband had a lengthy hospital stay before his tragic and untimely death. I was utterly shocked. They believed I was no longer alive. I truly have no idea where they got that information. There was no record of my death anywhere, especially not at the hospital where I underwent treatment. Moving on, my wife continued explaining that they were the closest relatives, so the house legally belonged to them. Dorothy informed them that someone named Richard did indeed reside there for a period, but he was divorced. She shared that during the time we were neighbors, I had confided in her about my wife leaving and my unilateral divorce filing. Dorothy also mentioned my intention to leave all my possessions to charity. To her knowledge, I had no other family aside from my brother, which is why she found it odd to see 2 women snooping around my home. She did admit that she might be mistaken. The atmosphere remained eerily silent for a while before Dorothy inquired whether they possessed a death certificate or a will. Their response was negative. Dorothy advised them that once they had those documents, they could visit the county's records office. If they could prove their rightful ownership of the property, they could obtain the deed in their name. My wife didn't handle this situation well. She confronted Dorothy, asking her who she thought she was, and she began shouting. She claimed that Dorothy had no right to tell her anything about her own husband. My wife told Dorothy to stay out of her business and to stop being so nosy. It was really embarrassing. The people in this neighborhood have all been kind to me, and my ex-wife was causing a scene and disrupting their peace. I considered stepping in and giving her a piece of my mind, but I chose to stick with my plan. Dorothy, who's truly kind, apologized, and explained she was only trying to assist. She returned to her home shortly after, and not long after that, my ex-wife and daughter left. After finishing work, I went over to Dorothy's place to apologize. She said it was okay and shared that she found my wife's behavior distasteful. She found the outburst rather amusing. I wish I could agree. I knew my wife could get quite angry when upset, but this was going too far. If she returns, I'm definitely going to confront her and ask her to let me live in peace. 3. She came back again yesterday. I was in my home office when I heard a loud crash. I headed to the living room, and to my surprise, my front window was shattered and people were outside yelling. I thought there might be a crazy person causing trouble. Well, I wasn't completely wrong. It turned out to be my ex-wife. She had broken my window, and my neighbors were outside trying to stop her. Apparently, she had been making a scene for a while, but I hadn't heard it because I was wearing noise-canceling headphones while I was working. I might not have heard her even if I hadn't paused my music to take a break. Once I got outside, 2 elderly neighbors were attempting to prevent my ex from causing more damage. Both she and Layla were holding baseball bats, and they had already broken a few of my potted plants. I grabbed her arm and questioned if she had lost her mind. Needless to say, she was surprised to see me alive and in person. I told both her and my daughter to leave my property before I called the police. I wasn't aware at that moment, but my neighbors had already contacted them. My ex seemed hurt by my words and asked why I hadn't reached out to her. She assumed that once I got better, she and Layla would have returned. I explained that when we got married, we made vows to support each other, in sickness and in health. But she broke that promise. I no longer wanted any connection with her. She's not my wife anymore. I sent the divorce papers months ago, and I once again told her to leave. Then she asked about our daughter. She mentioned that our daughter is heading to college next year and I can't cover the tuition on my own. I responded that our daughter was also fine with abandoning me, and I'm ready to relinquish all my parental rights to her. This should have been considered before you both left me. I don't want to have anything to do with either of you. Upon hearing that, she shifted from upset to angry. She started yelling at me, labeling me as selfish and heartless, which I found quite amusing. She's the last person who should be calling anyone selfish. I shouted back and called her an entitled a-hole. I made it clear that she wouldn't receive any financial help from me anymore. Just then she swung a bat at me, and that's when the police arrived. They promptly arrested both her and my daughter. They inquired if I wanted to press charges, and I certainly did. My ex-wife and daughter began crying loudly as they were being put into the police car. I didn't feel any sympathy for them. I had captured everything on camera, including my wife breaking the window, and I had already shared the evidence with the police. After my work hours were over, I ordered a new window and cleaned up the shattered glass. Tomorrow, someone will come to fix it. But in the meantime, I've put up a makeshift tarp to keep out the elements. Dorothy kindly provided me with buckets to hold my plants until I can replace the pots. My curiosity led me to do some research regarding why my ex-wife showed up unexpectedly. It turns out her mother passed away 2 months ago, and they discovered that the house they had been staying in wasn't actually owned by her or her late husband. It belonged to his cousin, who decided to kick them out to sell the property. With both of my ex-wife's parents gone, she and our daughter sold most of their belongings and have been living in a motel for a while. Upon returning to our former home and seeing my car, they assumed I had passed away. They went on a search for records of my possessions and purchases. That's how they managed to find me again. In any case, they're facing charges for vandalism, attempted break-in, and attempted offense. Since Layla is underage, she'll receive community service, but my ex-wife is definitely going to face legal consequences due to the evident premeditation. I'm considering obtaining a restraining order as well, at least for the time being. This way, I won't have to worry about her bothering me again for quite a while. I often wonder when I'll move past this. I'm a 24-year-old guy and my fiancée is a 25-year-old woman. We've been together for 6 years. I proposed to her during the COVID pandemic, and shockingly, she was having an affair when she accepted my proposal. It's hard for me to understand why anyone would do that. Accept a marriage proposal from one person while being involved with someone else. I'm not particularly smooth with the ladies. I've always been a bit awkward. But when I met my fiancé, whom I'll refer to as Bess, I fell head over heels in love within a matter of minutes. I'd never experienced love before, yet as soon as I met her, I knew she was the one I wanted to spend my life with. Strangely, she seemed to really like me too, and we were discussing kids and the possibility of moving in together by the end of that week. The time leading up to the day I discovered the truth was wonderful for me, though clearly it couldn't have been as great for Bess. One day I caught a glimpse of a message on her phone that gave me pause. That night, I lay awake thinking about it, and while she was sleeping, I got up and went through her phone. I'm quite comfortable with technology. I actually make a living by developing some mobile apps. While I'm not extremely wealthy, I could take a year off without facing serious financial repercussions. In any case, I didn't find anything that definitively proved her affair, but I did come across a lot of suspicious things like deleted messages. She also had a Snapchat contact with an icon suggesting a high level of interaction. Additionally, there were pictures of a guy I didn't recognize. I decided to install spyware on her phone, so I searched on Google and picked the priciest service available. This software allowed me to remotely access the camera and microphone. The following day, Bess was set to embark on a 5-day business trip. Given her sales job, this wasn't particularly unusual. However, once she left, the messages between them began flowing. I was utterly devastated. I ended up vomiting multiple times due to the shock of what I was reading. For quite a while, I resisted accepting the reality of it all. Eventually, I became fixated and started delving into anything I could access. I learned that their affair had commenced more than 2 months before I proposed. Her affair partner, a coworker, was a married man 10 years older than her. He had 3 children, and his wife was 7 months pregnant at that time. The ultimate blow was when I could hear them being intimate in a hotel room. They professed their love for each other, disparaged me and his wife, and even discussed the idea of running away to form a new family. This utterly devastated me. I was at a loss regarding what to do. I didn't have the courage to call and confront her. Eventually, I reached out to my childhood best friend, whom we'll call K. K grew up in a Brazilian favela and was tough as nails. He and his mother moved next door when I was 12, in the UK to be clear. K's father had passed away a few years prior, although we never talked about it much. His mother explained that he died due to random offense. My own mother left when I was 10. She had an addiction to pills, and my father never remarried. Although Kay didn't know English at all, over that first summer, we became close friends and learned each other's languages to some extent. It seems we bonded strongly due to our shared traumas. Kay and I have been inseparable since, which is a bit odd given that I'm a conflict-avoidant and socially awkward nerd. On the other hand, Kay is quite popular and fearless. He's not particularly large or muscular, but he's undoubtedly tough. Kay is widely loved. During high school, someone organized a surprise party for him and a whopping 250 people attended. Meanwhile, I can probably count my friends using one hand, and even then, 3 of them are more acquaintances than true friends. I confided in Kay, sharing the messages and emails I had uncovered. He remained silent for a significant period. He informed me that he couldn't offer specific advice because this was a matter I needed to handle on my own. I had to deal with it in the way that felt right for me. Then, he recounted an experience he had when he was with a girl who had cheated on him. He went to great lengths, exposing her to family and friends and cutting off all contact. I was utterly lost, and Kay's suggestion was the only thing I had to go on. I expressed my desire to do something similar to Bess. Over the next few days, we packed up all of Bess's belongings and took them to a storage unit. We changed the locks on my apartment and got ready to pick her up from the airport. Thankfully, Kay was the one driving, as I was actually sitting on my hands to conceal their trembling. When Bess got into the car, despite her cheerful demeanor, she instantly sensed that something was amiss with me. I simply mentioned that I wasn't feeling well. With a smile, Kay told her that I had a fun surprise planned for her at her parents' house. Throughout the entire trip, I remained silent, avoiding letting her see my face and attempting to fake a smile as best as I could. From the moment Bess entered the car, the rest of the day seemed to unfold in slow motion. The day prior, I had spoken to her parents and informed them that we were coming over. I told them that I had an exciting announcement to make. Upon our arrival, there were warm embraces and smiles, and I almost backed out at that point. I genuinely care for her parents. They've treated me well and always made me feel like part of the family. Soon enough, Bess was seated on the couch between her parents. At a certain point, someone inquired about the big surprise. Kay encouraged me to proceed. I began by expressing my deep affection for her parents and my gratitude for their warm reception and the way they made me feel like part of the family. Then I became emotional and struggled to speak for a few minutes. I had a well-prepared speech, eloquent and composed, but I completely blanked on it. So I blurted out, "Bess has been cheating on me with a coworker who has children, and his wife is 7 months pregnant. The engagement is off, the wedding is off, and our relationship is over. Bess, your belongings are in this storage unit." I dropped the key on the floor. "This is a permanent goodbye." I left while everyone remained in stunned silence. I overheard Kay telling them that I needed time to heal and to please only contact me if it's truly necessary. In the car, Kay advised me to post on the Facebook group. This group was where we were organizing the wedding. Everyone was part of it. My entire family, her whole family, friends, everyone. I posted a brief message that was nearly identical to what I had shared with her parents. And then I left the group. Kay kept saying he was proud of me and assured me that someday I would look back and be glad I stood up for myself. I was utterly shocked. Nothing about this situation felt positive or even real. Our next planned stop was at the coworker's wife's place. When she opened the door, I immediately blurted everything out without even introducing myself. I'm quite certain she slapped me at some point. As I handed her a thumb drive containing the evidence, her husband emerged from behind her. His wife began to shout immediately, instructing him to leave and not approach her. He attempted to offer excuses, but the moment he took a step forward, Kay was right there in his face in an instant. "You heard the lady, get out!" After a bit of back and forth, he eventually packed a bag and left. Kay had a conversation with his wife while I tried to process the mess my life had become. Eventually, we were invited inside. Kay called his mother, and we agreed to spend the night until her father could come the next morning to pick her up. She was scared that her husband might return, and she didn't want to be alone. Once inside, I felt invisible. No one noticed me. I sat there silently crying. While I understood that her situation was worse than mine, it still hurt that nobody even acknowledged me. At some point, everyone fell asleep, but I continued sitting there crying. I decided to end it all. I looked for pills, but I couldn't find any. In the end, I grabbed a long tool and planned to push it through my heart. I held the tool against my chest with both hands, took a deep breath, and it went a centimeter under my rib cage. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I left the tool on the table and returned to my chair, where I cried the rest of the night. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. Her father arrived at 5:30 in the morning and I let him in. He seemed remarkably calm given my appearance. He calmly asked me questions and if I was all right. I mumbled something incoherent. He went inside to find his daughter and I just stood there holding the door. Kay came out to talk to me, but I only stared at him before I passed out. I woke up in the hospital. That was 3 months ago. Kay stayed with me during the first few weeks after I got back home. He was worried I might try to offend myself again. I haven't spoken a word to my ex-fiancé. I changed my phone number, blocked her email, and cut off all access on social media. She has knocked on my door dozens of times, speaking through it, sometimes for up to 4 hours. She expresses how sorry she is and begs for forgiveness. She's claimed that she ended things with the other person, the AP. She says the AP's wife is divorcing him and that she lost her job because the AP's wife reported them to HR. Whenever she comes, I just sit on the other side of the door, listening to her while tears flow. It's like I'm inflicting pain on myself. I haven't replied to her yet. She's mentioned that she can sense movement at the door when I lean against it, so she knows I'm there. I haven't managed to heal at all. I still love her deeply, but my heart and soul are severely wounded. I'm consumed by anger, hatred, and shame. I understand I can never return to her, as it would utterly shatter my remaining self-esteem and self-respect. The confrontation at her parents' house and informing the AP's wife brought me no relief. If anything, I regret not just walking away from it all. People say that at some point you become numb or different. I hope that day comes soon for me, because right now, every day feels like a living nightmare. Update. I eventually decided to approach her parents to see if they could help convince her to stop coming to my door. Honestly, I don't care about her reasons or what she wants anymore. I've come to realize that how I perceived her and who she truly is are two different things. At this point, I just want her out of my life so I can move on. maybe I'll get a cat or something to keep me company. But before I could talk to her parents, her dad unexpectedly showed up at my door. He brought a six-pack of my favorite beer and asked if we could have a chat. I agreed, but I mentioned I was heading out and suggested we talk while walking. I didn't want him to come inside, not just because my apartment has been a mess and reflects my state of mind, but also because I didn't want to risk her showing up at the door suddenly. Plus, if things got awkward, I didn't want to ask him to leave. Confrontation isn't really my thing, as you know. He opened a couple of beers and he began talking. He started by apologizing on behalf of his daughter. Then he shared that his wife and daughter had been urging him to talk to me and convince me to talk to his daughter. But he made it clear that he had no intention of doing that. In fact, he supported the decisions and actions I had taken. He mentioned that his daughter had become spoiled and selfish, and he was hoping that she would finally have to face the consequences of her actions. He expressed the hope that maybe this experience would lead her to become a better person in the future. Then things took a strange turn. He started asking me a lot of questions about how I was doing. The questions he asked had a clear direction, and it was pretty obvious that he was hoping I was going through a lot of pain, right? It seemed like he was expecting me to be in considerable pain, and he might have even found some enjoyment in that. This really unsettled me, so I decided to tell him the exact opposite. I mentioned that I had moved on from his daughter, that her actions didn't bother me much, and that I was happy and moving forward. His reaction to my response was strange and disappointing. I couldn't figure out why he seemed that way. Then he started discussing my ex's pain. The way he talked about it was off, even though he was trying to mask it. It almost seemed like he was secretly pleased or finding some kind of joy in it. At that point, I decided to make a quick exit. I pretended I left something at home, said my goodbyes, and left in a hurry. I'm officially done with my ex now. Your advice, strangers on the internet, helped me snap out of it. I'm prepared to move on. Even though I'm still hurting and my self-esteem has taken a hit, I've reached a point where I'm ready to let go and move forward. Many of you were right, I think. I managed to avoid a serious problem, not just with my ex, but probably with her family as well. What kind of father takes pleasure in witnessing his own child suffering? Update. After reading the feedback on my previous post, I came to understand that I might have misinterpreted the situation with her father. He has consistently treated me well, and I hold a lot of respect for him. So I decided to reach out and have a conversation with him. You were correct. The questions he asked were leading because he was trying to figure out if there was a chance of reconciliation between me and his daughter. He mentioned he was hopeful about that possibility and that I had a positive influence on her. Interestingly, he also acknowledged that she didn't deserve me. Hearing this actually boosted my self-esteem, knowing he recognized this. The reason he had a smile while discussing his daughter was related to a long-standing disagreement he had with his wife about how to raise her. Over the years, he had repeatedly told his wife that allowing their daughter to get away with things, indulging her, and lacking discipline would lead to significant negative consequences in the future. His main regret regarding his daughter was allowing his wife to override his stance on this matter. He was smiling with a sense of anticipation as he was looking forward to proving his wife wrong. I asked him directly if everything was okay between us, and he assured me there were no issues at all. In a lighthearted manner, he joked about considering a divorce. Apparently, his confrontation with his wife and daughter after meeting me didn't go well. However, this time he expressed determination not to back down. It seemed like a confrontation that had been brewing for a long time. Regarding Kay, he has been consistently supportive, as always. He has stood by me and offered encouragement throughout. Now that I've distanced myself from the situation, I can see how right he was when he said I would eventually feel proud of my actions. I stood up for myself, something I rarely do, and I feel empowered by it. I'm certain I'll do the same in the future when it's necessary. My ex came to my door again, and this time I actually had a conversation with her. She pleaded with me to let her in so we could talk. However, I wasn't going to engage with her on her terms. If we were going to talk, it had to be under my conditions. I agreed, but I mentioned that I had some tasks to take care of first. I suggested meeting at a local park in half an hour. I didn't want her inside my messy place. Also, as some of you pointed out, meeting her alone could potentially protect me from any false accusations. Interestingly, I didn't feel nervous at all. In fact, I felt strangely good. For once in my life, I felt pretty confident in myself. So I went to the park and there she was, crying. We sat down and exchanged some trivial small talk. She attempted to pry into what her father and I had discussed, but I firmly told her that our conversation was private between him and me, and frankly, it wasn't her concern. As I started to lose interest, I asked her what she wanted to discuss. Then she launched into a lengthy monologue that lasted about an hour. She expressed how sorry she was, how much she loved me, how it was all so wrong, and how she had hurt me. She went on, begging me to consider reconciliation. She was willing to do anything. I told her that I forgave her because I didn't want to carry around the burden of anger, hatred, and pain any longer. However, I made it clear that reuniting was completely out of the question. It's not something that will ever happen. People who truly care for others don't behave the way she did towards me. Her actions have completely proven that she isn't a kind person. Acts like hers aren't what good people do. Having trust in her again is impossible for me. I explained to her that I want to share my life with someone who is kind, trustworthy, and truly loves and values me. Due to what she did, she no longer fits that role in my life. She cried uncontrollably, and I watched without much emotion. It was odd. I've never felt so detached from someone before. This sense of indifference isn't typical of me, at least not that I remember. I called her father to come pick her up, expressing hope that she seeks counseling to mend whatever is broken within her. I tried to offer some encouragement for her to overcome this situation, but she didn't seem receptive. Her dad arrived, and I explained the situation to him. I wished her well and good luck. Then I took an Uber to the local animal shelter and adopted a kitten. I named the kitten Shiny. Kay made a joke about my newfound courage, saying he was blinded by my shiny spine. So the kitten's name is Shiny, a reminder to stand up for myself. I'm content that I took the high road and honestly communicated with her without shouting or resorting to name-calling. I've been playing with my wonderful kitten, having a great time. Later, Kay is coming over for video games and some beers. I feel a sense of sadness for my ex and some pity. I'll miss the good moments we shared, but I'm also relieved that this chapter is closed. Some of you shared difficult truths that I needed to hear, and I'm thankful for that. We got hitched at 20, both of us. Around a year later, I decided to do the school thing again, to finish up my degree. Then we became parents, and I started feeling the heat to wrap up that degree of mine. My kiddo just hit 2 years old when I kicked off my final year of college. 2 semesters were all I needed to nail it, so in September of '93, my routine looked like this. I did a part-time gig from 3 in the morning till 7, stocking shelves at a store. Then a full-time gig, desk job at the police department, from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Tuesday nights were school nights, from 5:30 p.m. to 10, and I had school again on Saturdays, starting at 8 a.m. and ending by 2 p.m. Now my wife did the nurse's aide thing at the local hospital, clocking in from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. Our little one was taken care of by my mom. The cool thing was, everything, school, our jobs, and even my parents, was all super close by. I'm talking no more than 10 minutes to get from one to the other. We had a darn good setup going on, making things work as best we could for what I was aiming to achieve. Right before D-Day, the weekend was a non-stop battle between us. It was spring of '94, finals week for me. If I could wrap up my papers and ace my finals by the upcoming Sunday, we'd be cheering for me finishing up my bachelor's in science and finally getting out of this intense 8-month grind. However, she was mad because I wouldn't take a break from studying to take her and our kids somewhere. She'd been griping about my work and school for a while now, and it had gotten so bad that we hadn't been intimate for 2 months. On this specific Monday evening, I was double-checking a research paper I'd finished on Saturday, due on Tuesday evening, while she kept picking fights non-stop. Finally, I told her to shut up and quit acting childish. She stared at me and just blurted out, "I hate you and I'm in love with someone else." Bam! Just like that. I was floored. We argued for about an hour until she spilled the beans about what went down earlier that day during her lunch break at work. Apparently, for the past 2 months, she'd been caught up in an emotional thing with a janitor at the hospital. Well, it all started with him giving her compliments and just being around whenever she turned her head. Then things went up a notch to them having lunch together in the cafeteria, and after that, they began having regular sessions of bad-mouthing me to him. About 2 weeks ago, they took these complaint sessions to the car. She later admitted that during that time, they kissed twice. But today, things escalated to a full-on makeout session. It ended with her giving him a hand job while he was doing some stuff with his fingers, and they both went on about how much they loved each other. When she spilled this to me, I practically disconnected from reality. I mean, it's like I left this world for a moment. Later, I'll delve into more details about what was going on in my head that night. But for now, let me share what my wife wrote about that exact moment. It was weird. When I told him about what we did, I was kind of ready for some sort of explosion. But he just looked at me with the most awful pain you can imagine. Then it turned into something I can't even put into words. It was like he went blank. He turned away and walked into the bedroom, quietly shutting the door. I remember getting furious then. The jerk wouldn't even put up a fight for me? Right at that moment, I just felt like I'd made the right call and everything was going to somehow fall into place. I did it. I was finally breaking away from the guy who'd been ignoring me all these months. I walked back into the living room with a suitcase, walked past her, and headed straight out the front door. I recall her asking over and over, "Where the hell do you think you're going?" "Running back to Mommy's?" was one of the things she threw at me. I set the suitcase down in the driveway, went back inside, grabbed her purse and held it out, telling her to leave. That caught her off guard. She refused. So I lifted her gently onto my shoulder, carried her out the door, and set her on the car hood. Her surprise gave me the chance to dart back inside and lock the door. She tried to get in, but I held onto the deadbolt, and eventually, she left to crash at her parents' place. She let them know we were separating but didn't say why. That was a hell of a night. I rang up both jobs to explain a family emergency had popped up, and I wouldn't be making it in the next day. At some point, I drifted off to sleep. Update. I woke up at 7 and right away started figuring out how to cut down on contact with my soon-to-be ex, STBX. I rang up my mom to ask her if she could look after my son. She was concerned since he'd usually be there by that time. Then I jotted down a list of things I needed to get done that day, and I got cracking on the list. First, I dropped off my son and let my mom know I'd have to sit down and have a good talk with her later. After that, I swung by the office of a lawyer friend of the family. He'd known my dad from way back and I'd known him forever. I explained that I wanted to kick off the divorce process pronto. He heard me out and suggested I take some time to mull things over, but I was dead set. He said he could have the divorce papers done by the end of the day. I told him I'd come by to pick them up and then personally file them at the clerk's office. Handling stuff like this was kind of my gig at work with the PD. Next, I went and got new locks for the house and made a pit stop at the bank. I cleared out and closed both our savings and checking accounts. I took half the money, put it in an envelope, and swung by my sister-in-law's workplace. I handed her my wife's share of the cash. I told her to pass on the message to my wife. No contact with me whatsoever. And that money was her half from the bank. I also let her know I had gone ahead and canceled our only credit card. Back at my mom's place, I spilled everything to her. She and my younger sister cooked up a plan. My sis would hang at my house and take care of my son while I juggled work and school for the rest of the week. I headed home and swapped out the locks, spent the afternoon cleaning up and goofing around with my son, then headed off to school. Meanwhile, my wife decided to skip work that day. She got in touch with the janitor and laid out what had gone down. He was understanding and invited her over to his place that evening to escape the stress. I'll give you more scoop on this place in a bit. Long story short, she went over and hooked up with him. Here's what she wrote about that night. He passed out afterward. I recall being all hyped up at first, but during and after, it started to feel off. With him asleep, my mind started wandering. I thought about G, that's me, and how he had kind of pushed me into this. Made me go find someone else. I got up and left. On the drive home, memories of the first time G and I had sex came flooding back. We were each other's first. I totally lost it and just kept thinking about how disgusted I was with myself. Then I circled back to being mad at G all over again. It was like this twisted cycle. I just couldn't face up to how horribly messed up what I'd done was. I convinced myself it was his fault. Update. The day kicked off just like any other. I headed to work, then got back home, took a shower, and had breakfast with my son and sister. My wife gave me a ring, wanting to sort out plans to see our son. She had this arrogant and spiteful tone on the phone. I let her know I'd meet up on Sunday at 1 p.m., and she could hang with him at a nearby park. But she wasn't having it. She was gunning for a weekend with him. I shut that down. She realized that having him stay at the house solved the whole babysitting issue. Both her folks were working, so she didn't push it further. She slammed the phone down. Off to work at the PD I went, and at my earliest chance I swung by the clerk's office and got the divorce paperwork filed. Later in the day, a gal I knew there gave me a heads up that they were ready to head to the sheriff's office to get served. I called up a deputy I was familiar with and laid out the story, asking him to serve the papers to her while she was on the job. He agreed and said he'd do it the next day. Meanwhile, the STBX got back to work. Her janitor buddy swung by her spot and chatted her up throughout the day. Lunch wasn't doable that day, nor could they meet up in the evening. He claimed he had some commitment with one of his kids. He'd told my wife earlier on in the affair that he was divorced and had 3 kids. After work, she headed to her parents' place. Later that night, she called me 3 times, and each time I hung up the moment I realized it was her. Caller ID wasn't all that common in those days around where I was. Update. Following another night of heavy grieving, my day kicked off just like the previous one. I headed to work. As I got to my second job, I got a call from the deputy who was set to serve the papers. He mentioned he'd be there around noon. I said that was fine. Her lunch break was scheduled from 11 a.m. to noon. I sat at my desk making an attempt to focus on work. I was restless, getting up and heading to the bathroom about 3 times before I eventually threw up. I had to talk myself down and constantly remind myself that I was doing the right thing. Luckily, my wife hadn't reached out to me so far. 11 a.m. My wife meets up with the janitor for lunch. They slip away to his car in the parking lot and engage in intimate activity. Real classy. They clean up, return inside, and grab some food from the cafeteria for lunch. Noon. My wife heads back to the nurse station on her hall, accompanied by the janitor. They strike up a conversation with the RN in charge of the hall. 5 minutes later, the deputy walks in. He inquires with the RN about Kay, my wife. Kay speaks up, saying, "That's me." The deputy turns to her, and in a loud voice declares, "Mrs. Kay, you're being sued for divorce due to infidelity." My wife collapses onto the floor. Here's how she described the moment. When I heard that, this huge wave of shame and guilt hit me. It sunk in that I had wrecked my marriage, that Jew was actually going to divorce me. Part of me foolishly truly believed he wouldn't go through with it. I thought this was just another argument where I was trying to come out on top. It was some messed up thinking. Can recall the deputy physically lifting me and making me sit in the chair. There was screaming. It was coming from me. A, the RN, was trying to calm me down. T, the janitor, reached for my hand and I ended up punching him. He turned his head and my punch landed on his neck. I scratched him as he pulled away. A said I was shouting at him, going on about how he had ruined my life. Eventually, they managed to calm me down. The deputy mentioned that the janitor took off right away. She got herself together and went back to her shift, but A did a lot to cover for her. At 2:45 p.m., my wife was nearing the end of her shift when she got summoned to the hospital administrator's office. Fear gripped her. She figured someone must have reported her meltdown. When she walked in, the lady shut the door and wasted no time in telling her she was fired. She was instructed not to come back on the premise and that her final paycheck would be sent by mail. It turned out that someone had witnessed the rendezvous in the parking lot. They reported it. At some point, A had been brought in and shared the story about the divorce papers. The janitor had been called in for questioning, fired, and booted from the premises just an hour before my wife got fired. Word had spread throughout the hospital. She mentioned she just got into her car and drove over to her parents. At this stage, her folks still had no clue what was going on, just that she and I had split up, and things seemed pretty darn serious. At 5:30 p.m., I was having dinner with my son at home. My sister had gone out with her pals, so it was just us hanging out. The deputy had passed along the events from earlier, and I gotta say, it felt pretty satisfying knowing the impact. The fact that the janitor happened to be there was just sheer luck. I was surprised my wife hadn't been arrested for laying hands on him, but well, you can't have everything. Then a knock came at the door. In front of me stood a lady who couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, and she was incredibly pregnant. She could barely stand up straight. She asked for Kay. I explained that she no longer lived here and wasn't coming back. She asked if I was her husband. I replied, soon-to-be ex-husband. I'd served her the divorce papers earlier that day. She introduced herself as D, the janitor's wife, and revealed she was carrying their 4th child. I invited her in to take a seat. She went on to explain what had gone down earlier. about her husband and my wife getting the boot and the whole messy situation. I felt like I might throw up. Who on earth was this crazy woman I had married? She also filled me in on the house where my wife had been meeting him. At that moment, if I could have found him, I would have killed him without a second thought. Not for my wife, but for the sake of humanity in general. This guy was a total piece of garbage. I'll tell you more about the house later. She asked me where my wife was, and I told her she was with her parents. After she assured me that she only wanted to talk to her and reveal the truth, I gave her directions. My son was still at the table in his chair, visible from where we were sitting in the living room. She praised me for being a great dad, handling the care of my son on my own. Then she got up and left. At 6:30 p.m., my father-in-law answered the door and Dee asked to talk to my wife. Thinking she was one of Kay's friends, he went and got Kay, who stepped out onto the porch to chat. Dee introduced herself and let Kay know she just wanted her to understand the truth about her situation with the janitor. Turns out Dee and the janitor were still married and living together. Dee was in the 8th month of pregnancy, expecting their 4th child. Kay was already upset, tears flowing, and she kept apologizing again and again. But things were about to get worse. You see, the janitor and another guy at the hospital, along with one of their buddies, were involved in a twisted game. Their goal was to see how many married women they could sleep with in just 90 days. Before my wife, the third guy was in the lead with 3 conquests. My wife became the janitor's third. Oh, and the night he supposedly had something going on with one of his kids, he was actually with a 4th woman. Dee revealed that this lady he was with had been married for 25 years, and Dee was planning to inform her husband next. It turned out she was their neighbor. Now, about the house. It was a place they rented out to rendezvous with these women. Dee found out about this just 2 hours after he got fired. He came home, high and crying, and spilled everything, hoping to work things out. Dee left with the kids, telling my wife she was leaving him. Then she squared up her shoulders, slapped my wife hard across the face, and called her a dumb cow. Kay was in shock. Dee told her she ought to be ashamed of herself for throwing away her family. She told her how she had been at our place an hour ago, watching a loving man feed his son all alone because his wife was a stupid, selfish witch. My wife completely lost control and started crying, while Dee walked away, got into the car, and drove off. My in-laws checked on her once they heard the car pull away. She was pretty much in a daze. They brought her inside and were debating whether they should take her to the ER when she started talking erratically. My father-in-law thought she might be on some sort of stimulant. She began rambling about how awful she was and how she needed to fix things. They eventually managed to calm her down and got the full story. My father-in-law was deeply hurt. He's always been a good man, and he mentioned later that my wife could see the shame and disappointment on his face. As for my mother-in-law, well, she followed her usual pattern and pointed the finger at me. I can't say I'm a fan of her. Right then and there. Aftermath. The day after, my father-in-law reached out to me and said he was sorry. It was the only time I ever sensed there might be tears in his eyes. He filled me in on what had happened, explaining that Kay had been holed up in her room day and night. I mentioned the Sunday appointment I had arranged with Kay to meet at the park at 1. He agreed and hung up. I worked on Friday and attended school on Saturday. By day's end, I got the news that I had passed and would be receiving my degree. It was a mix of emotions, but I had made it. My parents threw a celebration that night, with extended family coming over for a barbecue. I'm fortunate to have a wonderful family. No one brought up Kay. The following day, I didn't hear from Kay at 1 as planned. I took it as a stroke of luck, something I could use if there was a custody hearing down the line. At 3:30, her father called. He let me know that Kay still wasn't responding coherently, just wandering around in her bathrobe with a notebook in her hands that she wouldn't let go of. She hadn't bathed in days and was barely eating. He was worried and exhausted. He even feared going to sleep in case she harmed herself. He asked me to come see her. I turned him down. I couldn't muster any feelings for her. I told him to get her professional help and that I would consider letting her see our son once she got herself back together. Honestly, I felt nothing for her. That initial night had tested me, and I emerged stronger. I'll explain more later. I wasn't going to invest any care into her ever again. I didn't hear from her or her family for the next 2 weeks. Reconciliation. A A couple of weeks had passed since my last conversation with my father-in-law. During that time, I quit my part-time job and was actively hunting for a new one. My MBA plans were on hold as I aimed to settle into a new job first. My son had been asking about his mother, and all I could do was reassure him. The longer she took to reach out to see him, the better it could be for my chances of securing a favorable custody arrangement. I was at the police department, when she called, asking to schedule a time to meet and see our son. I inquired if she had managed to compose herself enough not to frighten him, and she replied affirmatively. I arranged to meet her at 9 a.m. in the park on Saturday and requested that she bring her dad along. I didn't want to meet her alone, so my mother accompanied me. Upon seeing her, I felt confident that my decision to limit her contact to just 2 hours was the right one. She was in a bad state, noticeably thinner, no makeup, and smelling of ivory soap. None of those familiar feminine scents I associated with her. Later, I found out that her mother had bathed and dressed her. Kay wasn't fully functional yet. Our park meetings continued for about 3 weeks, and I eventually extended them to 4 hours, including Sundays. Her appearance improved each week, but I remained concerned about her mental well-being. Therefore, I refused to let our son stay overnight with her or see him alone. Eventually, my mother-in-law grew tired of this arrangement and decided to hire a lawyer to file for custody. Now, Kay hadn't signed the divorce papers yet, and I was all right with that. After 6 months, I could file for divorce through the court anyway. But the custody lawsuit infuriated me because she was aiming for full custody. I'd already discussed with her father that I was open to eventually working toward a 50-50 custody split, but her mother threw that out the window. In response, I counteracted with a request for full custody based on her mental state. Honestly, I was itching for a confrontation. I was furious and needed a way to release that pent-up anger. This was the opportunity. On the day of the custody hearing, my lawyer informed me that her attorney had approached him with a request. Kay wanted to talk to me privately. I initially refused. He mentioned it might be an offer, so I relented, but insisted it should be in the hallway outside the courtroom, where both attorneys could witness it but not hear the conversation. They agreed. She began with small talk, asking about our son and how he was doing. I replied he was great and improving daily. She asked about my schooling, and I informed her I passed and would be graduating next week. She seemed pleased with that. Then she looked down and inquired if she could attend my graduation. I responded that my graduation was meant for my family and friends, and since she was neither, the answer was no. That hit her hard. Throughout most of our relationship, we had worked together diligently to achieve that goal. By saying no, I conveyed that she couldn't share in that accomplishment with me. She pleaded, but I held my ground and repeated my refusal. I added, "It's special to me. It didn't matter enough to you when you let someone treat you like garbage." I was truly turning into quite an asshole, fueled by the desire to hurt her. She welled up with tears, turned around, and walked back to her lawyer. The hearing got underway. I testified, nothing out of the ordinary. Then my mother-in-law stood up and blamed me for everything. She claimed I was seeing someone and driving my wife insane. No evidence of that, but truth was never her concern. She also alleged that I had assaulted my wife by grabbing and throwing her onto the car hood the night she left. Next was my wife's turn. Kay started responding to her attorney's questions but stopped after the third one. She asked the judge if she could speak up. He suggested she confer with her attorney first, but she declined. He granted her permission. Here's what my wife wrote in her notebook. "I remember feeling so sad as the hearing started. I listened to G presenting his side of the story and how he'd taken care of J, our son, all these weeks. I needed to make things right. Sitting there, I knew my mom was lying to shield me, but it was just one more lie on top of another. I'd had enough. I had to fix this." Kay then stated that she wanted to apologize to my parents, who were in the room. She also expressed remorse to her own parents. Looking at me, she acknowledged that I probably hated her more than anyone else right now. She admitted that everything that happened was her fault and that, at this point, she just wanted to salvage whatever was left of our shared history. Even if it was just to reach a point where I could look at her without disgust. Then she turned to the judge and expressed her desire to retract her claim, stating that she would accept any custody arrangement I deemed appropriate. I conferred with my attorney, and we proposed supervised 1-hour visits for 6 weeks, followed by weekends with him every other week, provided there were no issues. We adjourned. In hindsight, I think that's when I glimpsed a tiny hint of potential for us to be more civil to each other. Not a reconciliation, but at least a sense of mutual respect. The schedule worked well. By the third week, our visitation time expanded to 3 or 4 hours, just the three of us, her, me, and our son. Although I wasn't exactly friendly, I relished observing my son enjoy his time with his mom. It was beneficial for them both. However, during the 5th visit, there was a negative incident. She unexpectedly hugged my right arm from behind while I was watching our son play. I panicked and yelled at her never to touch me again. She hugged our son and left in a hurry. The next week, we acted as if nothing happened, and she maintained her distance. Another month went by and we started discussing day-to-day matters more frequently. I'd landed a new job with better pay, and she had begun nursing school. She started confiding in me that the janitor was persistently calling her and wouldn't leave her alone. She claimed she wanted to be honest with me in case I heard something. Apparently, she had asked him to stop bothering her, yet he still turned up at her parents' house one evening. Her father-in-law even threatened to harm him if he didn't back off. I told her I no longer cared who she was involved with. She insisted she wasn't sleeping with anyone and wouldn't until she was sure our family could never be repaired. I bluntly stated that it was never going to happen. 6 months after our separation, I brought up the matter of her signing the divorce papers. She refused. I reminded her that I didn't necessarily need her signature, but it would be easier if she complied. She proposed coming over to the house that night to discuss it. She offered to sign the papers that night if I still wanted a divorce. I agreed. When she arrived, she had these notebooks, those little black composition books that look like bound volumes. She told me she had begun jotting down thoughts the day after she received the divorce papers. She didn't exactly know why, but it seemed to provide some sort of solace. She told me she wrote down every single thing she could recall about what had occurred, delving into as much detail as she could muster. She wanted me to read it, but cautioned that it would hurt deeply. In those writings, she detailed her interactions with the janitor, what she said and did. I wasn't eager to go through it. She acknowledged the risk she was taking, but she felt the need to help me understand why she was so determined to salvage our marriage. Reluctantly, I read it. She was right. It was tough. The physical aspect wasn't explicitly described, but the way she discussed me and our marriage in front of him, that cut to the bone. The account I read that night also chronicled her emotional breakdown. The writing was chaotic and disordered. Yet, each day it improved bit by bit. Eventually, she started dissecting her actions and words, using it as her own form of therapy. One amusing part was when she recounted a bizarre notion she had, believing it would miraculously set things right. You see, she remembered she hadn't orgasmed with the guy, not even once. In her mind, if she didn't climax, then it meant she didn't derive any pleasure from it. Therefore, she had done nothing wrong, and I should take her back. She clung to that idea until she shared it with her dad, much to his discomfort, and he pointed out that it didn't work that way. Although reading her account didn't alter my decision, it did alarm me. I still had concerns about her mental state. Only after reading what she had written during those 2 weeks did I fully grasp the fragility of her mind. I agreed to give it more time, partly out of apprehension. This newfound courage in her led her to urge me to write to her. Sit down, put together a letter or something detailing what had occurred. She believed it would give her insights into how to support me better. I considered this proposal. I recognized I was still in a messed up state, but maybe it could aid me in moving forward and perhaps maintaining some form of a healthy relationship later on. What she called her writing therapy gradually transformed into our method. We committed to meeting twice a week. Our initial task was to jot down our perceptions of our marriage's state before D-Day. During our meetings, we'd exchange our letters and take notes. Then we'd put our queries in writing and pose them to each other. We'd converse until each question was thoroughly addressed before moving on to the next. If we didn't complete everything, we'd continue during the next session. The guidelines were simple: be truthful, no yelling, and no avoiding any questions. Our journey began with assessing our pre-D-Day relationship, and we progressed through each subsequent day until the Sunday I conversed with her father after she received the divorce papers. Beyond that, we planned to reassess and proceed accordingly. I have to admit I acted quite terribly throughout this process. I provided honest answers to questions except for one. More on that later. However, I used it as an opportunity to embarrass her. I made her repeatedly recount hurtful things she had said to him about me. I pushed her to share explicit details about the physical encounters. She hesitated at times, but she ultimately followed through. Although it was comparatively mild compared to what we once shared, it stung. Truthfully, I believed I could handle it because I genuinely wasn't interested in rekindling the relationship. Yet, hearing it was painful. It's astonishing how unkind I had grown, though in my mind it felt justified back then. About a month into this process, I had to admit it was somewhat beneficial for me. She suggested the idea of moving back in and trying the next phase. I declined. She pleaded and presented a compelling case, but I stood firm. Even if I considered reconciliation, I couldn't imagine being intimate with her again. She understood and even proposed that I could seek outside companionship while she remained faithful. That's not something I would be comfortable with, so I declined. Another month passed and I finally relented, but I established firm, non-negotiable rules for the path ahead. First, she had to sleep in the spare room. Second, absolutely no physical contact whatsoever. Third, she kept her money in her checking account, but I handled her banking and provided her with checks for bills, rent for the room, expenses, and some spending money. This was because she had given the janitor $300 from our savings account a week before D-Day. Also, I thought she might say no and not move in. Fourth, her mother wasn't allowed into my home unless we decided to reconcile. I was still mad at her. Still am a bit. Fifth, all previous custody agreements would automatically resume if we didn't reconcile. Sixth, if I started seeing someone else, she had a week to find another place to stay. She agreed and moved back in. It was tougher than I anticipated. There was no longer that cooling off period between the times I saw her. She was there all the time. I picked fights over small things constantly and said hurtful things to her. I wanted her out almost as soon as she moved back in. I needed a solution, so we started having what we called Thursday night fight night. This came from our meetings where we were writing things down. Every Thursday night after our child was asleep, we'd sit in the living room and discuss ongoing issues or arguments. They had to be resolved on Thursday night before going to bed and couldn't be carried forward. We actually still have a version of this today. It evolved into simply asking during dinner if there's anything we need to discuss that night. The kids never knew where it originated or what it was. I was still being difficult. I threw her affair in her face at every opportunity. She handled it calmly and never engaged when it escalated to that point. I'd say I was emotionally abusive towards her. However, she was strong. She believed we were meant to be together, and that since she had wrecked our lives, she had to rebuild it on her own until I saw things her way and joined her. She was dedicated to giving me the time I needed. 6 months after she moved back in, I had my own breakthrough. After a particularly rough day with constant triggers, I locked myself in the bedroom. I just couldn't handle it anymore. My wife came to the door and knocked, quietly saying, "You need to talk. I'll be out here whenever you're ready." I heard her slide down the door, sit on the floor and lean against it. She stayed there for an hour. It was nearly midnight when I finally opened the door. She asked if she could come in and I said no, suggesting we go to her room. We sat, she on the bed, me in a chair, and I finally opened up about what happened after I asked her to leave on the night I learned about the affair. Let's rewind to the evening of D-Day. After she drove away, I spent a lot of time in my son's room, just watching him sleep. I went to my desk, grabbed the checkbook and bill ledger, and took them, along with a copy of the life insurance policy, placing them in plain view on the kitchen table. I took a shower and then entered the bedroom, retrieving my piece from the closet shelf and placing it on the bed. I dressed in jeans, a button-down shirt, and even tucked in my shirt tail. I combed my hair and sat on the bed, holding the barrel of the piece in my mouth. I tasted the oil on it, which I had strangely fixated on. It tasted exactly as it smelled. I have no idea how long I sat there. Eventually, I unloaded it, put it away, undressed, and went to bed. Unfortunately, I think many betrayed spouses have thoughts like this at some point. I told her that was the one thing I hadn't shared during our recovery. For the first time, I allowed her to hug and kiss me on the forehead, not as a farewell, but in a different way. It was the first emotional connection I permitted. I confessed that I forgave her that night, even though I didn't truly mean it then. It was months later before I genuinely forgave her, but expressing those words started to open a door for me. Following that, physical touch gradually increased. Holding hands, quick kisses, hugs. These became more common in our interactions. Sex wasn't happening yet, but we were moving in that direction. Finally, almost a year after she moved back in, we became intimate. I think of this as our time of hysterical bonding. She continued journaling, and according to her, we had sex 32 times in 28 days. Years later, in a conversation, she shared that until that night, she woke up every morning thinking it might be our last day together. She kept telling herself to just hold on for one more day. She knew me well enough to understand that sex meant I was reconnecting emotionally. Today, our marriage is strong. We've both succeeded in our careers and raised 3 grown children. To our knowledge, they're unaware of any of this. We don't plan to tell them, but we won't lie if they ask. We've undergone significant changes. My wife is much stronger and wiser now. She views this as an unnecessary evil she caused, but one she triumphed over. Sometimes I think she still holds herself accountable. For my part, this topic doesn't surface in our discussions or arguments anymore. It hasn't in over 20 years. She's perceptive and often senses when I'm triggered, which still happens occasionally, maybe once or twice a year. These moments are swift but stinging. Her response is comforting. She'll hold my hand, hug me, and say, "I love you," or "thank you." I've lost some of my inner goodness. I tend to keep my feelings to